Thank you, Alaistair, for a very inspiring talk. I have sort of one comment on you were tracing Mary McLeod's genetic ancestry and her journey to America, and her making it good. The poor girl on the immigrant boat who made it good and carried over her psychological heritage and handed it on to Donald. And how you do that thread of the wall with Mexico and the light and the dark and the shadow of the feminine unconscious, where she was not owning and he is not owning, and what I'm inspired. The question comes to me is, how can I own my own shadow in this transition from the darkness to the light? And the feminine unconscious seems to be transferred from Mary to Donald there, and I think you were calling him home, so I ask that we come home to our own personal and collective shadows and stop putting it out there.
Thank you very much. If you wish, you can also say your name and also.
Danny Cusack. Alaistair, in terms of the current US president, I put president in inverted commas for those of us who don't recognise his legitimacy, because after all he lost by 3 million votes, nearly 3 million votes, as was well known. My question is this: it's a useful exercise. Is it possible to exaggerate the influence of religion in the current US president? After all, it only represents one side of his parentage. I would suggest it's not the dominant side, that these dominant values are from his father. And to use an analogy with Israel, right-wing Israeli politicians often use religious language to justify their position, when in reality they're much more hard-headed and tough-minded. I would suggest that about the US current president. He's much more business-oriented, tough-headed, and tough-minded and hard-headed. Thank you.
My name is Donald Dorr. I was just wondering, how do you actually manage to hold together in your own, inside yourself, psychologically, the almost violence, the outrage of your condemnation of Trump with the peacefulness of the very end of your film? I know that Jesus was good at holding these two together, but how do you do it personally?
Okay, I'll give Alaistair a chance to respond to, what's your first? Anya. No, Anya's question first, then Danny's, and then Donald's. Thanks.
Well, those are wonderful questions, because they allow me to address material I just didn't have time to attempt during the talk there. I'm going to take the second one first. Is it possible to exaggerate the role of religion? Is that being exaggerated here? My sense is that Donald Trump himself is not a very religious person at all. But Donald Trump got in because he won 81% of the evangelical vote in America. And that evangelical constituency accounts for about 25% of Americans. So my argument, and what I've, in the published work I've done on this, my argument is really, the question is not so much what is going on in Donald Trump as somebody who may or may not be religious. It's more his understanding, coming out of that cultural background, that has enabled him to work that evangelical electorate. What he's carrying within him, what he's embodying within himself, speaks both consciously and unconsciously to that electorate. So you cannot put any numbers on whether or not Donald's religiosity has played a factor. All you can do is listen to what he says and observe his prayer breakfasts the day before yesterday, etc. But you can put numbers on his influence on the evangelical vote. And that was a decisive factor in him being elected. And so to the question, to Anya's question of how do we carry the psychological heritage of the shadow. That's one of the major aspects of what I was speaking to the Irish Army about yesterday. Basically, the shadow is all the sides of ourselves that we reject, that we deny, that has never been able to be properly born within ourselves. Therefore, Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychologist who used that term, he said 90% of the shadow is gold dust. The cutting edge of our spiritual work as what I call spiritual activists, people who are activists for social and environmental and religious change, coming from a spiritual place. The cutting edge is our shadow work. Our work was both the shadow of others as it plays out in the world, the blind spots, the way in which hatred comes out as realizing, but equally the shadow is in ourselves. And so to the third question, how do you hold together the tension between the violence or the anger and the compassion? And I think many of us in this room probably feel that tension. We will be feeling angry about what Trump or Brexit with a similar dynamic is doing and how it's hurting people. We will feel righteous indignation at that. But we also know that if we're going to be people of peace, we have to turn back the streams of war in Brigid's way. We have to remember that she's patron saint not just of smithscraft, and may those weapons be metaphorical weapons, but also of poetry and of healing. Now, one of the reasons why I'm attached to the Quaker tradition is that we have an understanding in that tradition of the importance of holding the opposites within ourselves. If you deny the opposites within yourself, you push them down into the shadow, you push them into the unconscious. And Carl Jung said, the problem is not that we all have shadows, the problem is that the shadow denied is the shadow that we trip up over. Therefore, a Quaker friend of mine, who's also a Sufi, said to me the other day, he said, the good thing about Donald Trump is that he illuminates the American shadow. Again, the issue is not so much Donald Trump, it is the forces that have put Donald Trump into power that have illuminated. But we need to go one further. We also need to allow that to illuminate our own shadow. Part of what I'm doing as somebody coming out of that Presbyterian tradition, one of my forebears was Thomas Boston, a leading evangelical writer of the 17th century. Another was a founder that he carried the Bible out to help create the Free Church in Compton in 1843, right next door to Lady Mary's place. Standing in that tradition, part of what I'm trying to do is to help us to understand the shadow side of our own tradition. Because only if we understand that shadow does it come into balance, and can the beauty of the tradition shine out. In the same way, only when we come to terms with our own shadows can our spiritual beauty start to emerge more deeply.